Chapter 18. Florence's story of the lost mine fired Madeline's guests with the fever for gold hunting. But after they tried it a few times, and the glamour of the thing wore off, they gave up and remained in camp. Having exhausted all the resources of the mountains, such that had interest of them, they settled quietly down for a rest, which Madeline knew would soon end in the desire for civilized comforts. They were almost tired of roughing it. Madeline's discomfort manifested itself in her remark, "I guess nothing's going to happen after all." Madeline awaited their pleasure in regard to the breaking of camp, and meanwhile, as none of them cared for more exertion, she took her walks without them, sometimes accompanied by one of the cowboys, always with the hounds. These walks furnished her exceeding pleasure, and now that the cowboys would talk with her without reserve, she grew fonder of listening to their simple stories. The more she knew of them, the more she doubted the wisdom of shut-in lives. Companionship with Nels and most of the cowboys was in its effect like that of the rugged pines and crags in the untainted wind. Humor, their predominant trait when a person grew to know them, saved Madeline from finding their hardness trying. They were dreamers, as all men who lived lonely lives in the wilds were dreamers. The cowboys all had secrets. Madeline learned some of them. She marveled most of the strange way in which they hid emotions, except a violence of mirth and temper so easily aroused. It was all the more remarkable in the view of the fact that they felt intensely over little things which men of the world were blind and dead to. Madeline had to believe that a hard and perilous life in barren and wild country developed great principles in men. Living close to earth, under the cold and the bleak and all the dust-veiled pines, and men grew like the nature that developed them, hard, fierce, terrible perhaps, but big with elemental forces. But one day, while out walking alone, before she realized it, she had gone a long way down a dim trail winding along the rocks. It was the middle of the summer afternoon, and all about her were shadows of the crags crossing the sunlit patches. The quiet was undisturbed. She went on, and not blind to the fact that she was perhaps gone too far from camp, but risking it because she was sure of her way back and enjoying the craggy recesses that were new to her. Finally, she came out upon a bank that broke abruptly into a beautiful little glade. Here she sat down to rest before undertaking the return trip. Suddenly Russ, the keener of the staghounds, raised his head and growled. Madeline feared he might have scented a mountain lion or a wild cat. She quieted him and carefully looked around. To each side was a regular shape of massive blocks of stones that were withered from the crags. The little glade was open and grassy, and here a pine tree, there a boulder. The outlet seemed to go down into a wilderness of canyons and ridges. Looking in this direction, Madeline saw a dark, slight figure of a woman coming stealthily along under the pines. Madeline was amazed, and then a little frightened, for that stealthy walk from tree to tree was a suggestion of secrecy, if not worse. Presently the woman was joined by a tall man who carried a package which he gave to her. They came up the glade and appeared to be talking earnestly. In another moment, Madeline recognized Stuart. She had no greater feeling of surprise than had it been first hers, but for the next moment she scarcely thought at all, merely watching the couple approaching. In a flash came back her former curiosity to Stuart's strange absence from camp, and then, with the return of her doubt of him, the recognition of the woman. The small, dark head, the brown face, the big eyes, Madeline now saw discerningly belonged to the Mexican girl, Benita. Stuart had met her there. This was the secret of his lonely trips, taken ever since he had come to work for Madeline. This secluded glade was a rendezvous. He had her hidden there. Quietly, Madeline arose with a gesture to her dogs and went back along the trail towards camp. Succeeding her surprise was a feeling of sorrow that Stuart's regeneration had not been complete. Sorrow gave place to the insufferable distrust that while she had been romancing about that cowboy, dreams of her good influence upon him, he had been merely bias. Somehow it stung her. Stuart had been nothing to her, she thought, but yet she was proud of him. She tried to resolve the thing to be fair to him, which every instinctive tendency was to expel him, all pertaining to him for her thoughts. In her effort at sympathy, in extenuation failed utterly before her pride. Exerting her great will power, she dismissed Stuart from her mind. Madeline did not think of him again till late in that afternoon, when, as she was leaving her tent to join several of her guests, Stuart appeared suddenly in her path. "Miss Hammond, I saw your tracks down the trail," he began eagerly, but his tone was easy and natural. "I'm thinking, well, that maybe you got an idea." "I do not wish for an explanation," interrupted Madeline. Stuart gave a slight start. His manner had a semblance of the old cool audacity. As he looked down at her, it suddenly changed. With effort, Madeline thought, to face her before her guests was an explanation of his conduct. Suddenly she felt an inward flare of fire that was pain, so strange, so uncomprehendable that her mind whirled. And then anger possessed her, not at Stuart, but at herself, that anything could rouse in her a raw emotion. She stood there, outwardly cold, serene, with level, haunty eyes, as she looked upon Stuart, but inwardly she was burning with rage and shame. "I'm sure you're not gonna have you thinking," he began, pausing, and passionately he broke off, but a slow, dull crimson blotched across the healthy red-brown of his neck and cheeks. "What you do or think, Stuart, is no concern of mine." "Miss Hammond, you don't believe—" faltered Stuart. The crimson receded from his face, leaving it pale. His eyes were appealing. They had kind of a timid look that struck Madeline, even in her anger. There was something boyish about him now. He took a step forward and reached out with his hand open-palmed in a gesture that was humble, yet held a certain dignity. "But listen, never mind now what you think about me. There's good reason." "I've no wish to hear your reason." "But you ought to," he persisted. "Sir?" Stuart underwent another swift change. He started violently, a dark tide shaded his face, a glitter gleamed into his eyes. He took 2 long strides and loomed over her. "I'm not thinking about myself," he thundered. "Will you listen?" "No," she replied, and there was a freezing haunter in her voice. With the slightest gesture of dismissal, unmistakable in its finality, she turned her back upon him, and then she joined her guests. Stuart stood perfectly motionless, and then, suddenly, he began to lift his right hand, in which he held his sombrero. He swept it up and high over his head. His tall form towered. With sudden fierceness, he flung his sombrero down. He leapt at the black horse and dragged him to where his saddle lay. With one pitch, he tossed the saddle upon the horse's back. His strong hands flashed at girths and straps. Every action was swift, decisive, and fierce. Bounding for his bridle, which hung over a brush, he ran against a cowboy who awkwardly tried to avoid the onslaught. "Get out of my way!" he yelled. Then, with the same savage haste, he adjusted the bridle on his horse. "Maybe you better hold on a minute, Gene, old feller," said Monty Price. Monty, you want me to brain you? Said Stewart, with a short ring in his voice. Now, considering the high class of my brains, I ought to be real careful to be keeping them, replied Monty. You can bet your life, Gene, that I ain't going to get in front of you, but I'm just saying, listen. Stewart raised his dark face, and everybody listened. Everybody heard the rapid beat of horses' hooves. The sun had set, but the park was light. Nels appeared down the trail, and his horse was running. In a moment, he was in the circle, pulling his bay back to a sliding halt, and he leapt off abreast of Stewart. Madeline saw and felt the difference in Nell's presence. "What's up, Gene?" he inquired sharply. "I'm leaving camp," replied Stewart thickly. His black horse began to stamp as Stewart grasped bridle and mane and kicked the stirrup round. Nell's long arm shot out, and his hand fell upon Stewart, holding him down. "Sure, I'm sorry," said Nell slowly. "Then you's going to be hitting the trail?" "I'm going. Let go, Nels." "Sure you ain't going, Gene?" "Let go, damn you," cried Stewart as he wrestled free. "What's wrong?" asked Nels, lifting his hand again. "Man, don't be touching me." Nels stepped back instantly. He seemed to become aware of Stewart's white, wild passion, and again Stewart moved to mount. "Nels, don't make me forget that we're friends," he said. "Well, sure, I'm not forgetting," replied Nels, "and I resign my job right here and now." His strange speech checked the mounting cowboy. Stewart stepped down from the stirrup. Then their hard faces were still and cold while their eyes locked glances. Madeline was as much startled by Nell's speech as Stewart's. Quick to note a change in these men, she now sensed that one of them was unfathomable. "Resign?" questioned Stewart. "Sure. What do you think I'd do under circumstances as that come up?" "But see here, Nels, I won't stand for it." "Well, you're not my boss no more, and I ain't beholden to Miss Hammond neither. I'm my own boss, and I'll do as I please. Got her, senor?" Nell's words were a variance with the meaning in his face. "Gene, you sent me on a little scout down the mountains, didn't you?" he continued. "Yes, I did," replied Stewart with a new sharpness in his voice. "Well, I'll show you that you was so good and right in your figuring as opposing to mine, that I'm sick with admiring you. If you hadn't sent me, well, I'm reckon something might have happened. As it is, we're sure against a hell of a proposition." How significant was the effect of his words upon all the cowboys. Stewart made a fierce and violent motion, terrible where his other motions had been but passionate. Monty leapt straight up in the air with a singular action as suggestion of surprise as it was a wild acceptance of malice. Like a stalking giant, Nick Steele strode over to Nels and Stewart, and the other cowboys rose silently without a word. Madeline and her guests, in a little group, watched and listened, unable to divine what all this strange talk and action meant. "Hold on, Nels. They don't need to hear about it," said Stewart hoarsely, as he waved a hand towards Madeline's silent group. "Well, I'm sorry, but I reckon they may as well know first as last. Maybe this yearning wish of Miss Hallin's for something to happen might come true. Sure, I—" "Cut out the joshin'," rang out Monty's voice. It had to be as decided an effect of any preceding words or actions. Perhaps it was the last thing needed to transform these men, doing unaccustomed duty as escorts of beautiful women, to their natural state as men of the wild. "Tell us what's what," said Stewart, cool and grim. "Don Carlos and his guerrillas are camping on the trails that lead up here. They got all the trails blocked, and by tomorrow they'll have us corralled. Maybe they meant to surprise us. He's got a lot of greasers and outlaws with him, and they're well armed. Now what do they mean? Y'all can figure it out to suit yourselves. Maybe the Don just wants to pay a sociable call upon his ladies, and maybe his gang is some hungry as usual. Maybe they want to steal a few horses or anything they can lay hands upon. Maybe they mean worse, too. Now my idea is that maybe it's wrong. I long since separated from love with the greasers. That black-faced Don Carlos has had a good deep game. That two-bit of a revolution is having hard times, and the rebels want American intervention. They'd stretch any point to make trouble, and we're only 10 miles from the border. Suppose some of them guerrillas got our crowd across that border. The U.S. cavalry would follow. Y'all know what that would mean. Maybe Don's mind works that way, maybe it don't. I reckon we'll know soon. And now, Stuart, whatever the Don's game is, sure you're the man to outfigure him. Maybe it's just as well you're good and mad about something, and I resign my job because I want to feel unbeholden to anybody. Sure struck me long since that the old days he'd come back for a little spell, and there had been trailing a promise not to hurt any greaser. End of chapter 18.